is Indian Country Today.
Welcome, and thank you for joining us. Indian Country Today headlines for July 20th. School districts across Indian Country and the nation are trying to figure out how and when they can safely bring students back to campus. In the Phoenix area, classes are supposed to begin again the week of August 4th, but Arizona remains a COVID-19 hotspot with a surge of cases. The Trump administration wants schools to reopen for full in-person classes, and it threatens to reduce federal spending in districts that do not start back up again in August or September. The American Academy of Pediatrics, the American Federation of Teachers, the National Education Association, the American Association of School Administrators, and school superintendents issued a joint statement on safe return to school, asking for politics to not be a factor. Returning to school is important for the healthy development and well-being of children, the statement read. We should leave it to health experts to tell us when the time is best to open up school buildings and listen to educators and administrators to shape how we do it. The debate about native tree mascots is moving front and center to the high school level, but the issue goes beyond the field because while professing to honor Native history, those same schools offer little in the way of curriculum or history. A study by the nonprofit Illuminative found that 87% of state-level history standards failed to cover Native history after 1900. The clock is ticking for the Special Diabetes Program for Indians. It is a $150 million a year federal program that has successfully reduced diabetes rates in many Native communities. Tribal leaders say the program is vital, especially during the COVID-19 pandemic. The authorization for the program is set to expire November 30th. A bipartisan reauthorization bill would fund the program for 5 more years and increase federal funding to $200 million. Native American adults have the highest rates of diabetes in the US and are twice as likely as white adults to have chronic disease, according to the Centers for Disease Control and Prevention. One reason why the program is so important is that it has a track record of success. A study published in April shows that after years of increasing, the percentage of Native American adults with diabetes decreased from 15.4% in 2013 to 14.6% in 2017. And the proportion of American Indian and Alaska Native adults with diabetes has not increased since 2013. More than 300 tribes are engaged in diabetes education, and 66 are funded directly through the Special Diabetes Program for Indians. One federal study estimates the Special Diabetes Program has resulted in a cost savings of some $439 million because of less spending on end-stage renal disease, which is covered by Medicare. We turn now to Indian Country Today's Deputy Managing Editor, Jordan Bennett-Vigay, who has been tracking COVID-19 in Indian Country.
Mark. We have COVID-19 updates from 6 tribes across the country from the weekend. And here's a look at the latest numbers from our database. There are 14,464 positive cases and 591 deaths in the Indian health system. Again, that's a total of 14,464 positive cases and 591 deaths as of July 20th. In Arizona, the San Carlos Apache tribe has a total of 292 cases and 7 deaths. Out of these positive cases, 24 cases and 5 deaths are tribal citizens who live off the reservation. And in the last few days, the Cherokee Nation saw an additional 111 new cases come in. And the tribe now has a total of 518 cases. And again, Oklahoma is one of the hot spots for the Cherokee Nation where they're based at. And the Eastern Band of Cherokee Indians in North Carolina reported 3 new cases, bringing their total to 96 cases and 2 deaths. And cases for the White Mountain Apache tribe seem to be slowing down a bit over the weekend. They had a total of 38 cases and 1 death, and this gives the tribe a total of 2,144 cases and 32 deaths. And the Navajo Nation, which spans across parts of Arizona, New Mexico, and Utah, reported 107 cases and 15 deaths over the weekend. The tribe ended its 3rd weekend lockdown after a short pause and will be adding 2 additional weekends. And tribal officials say that an order is being developed that will require Navajo Nation residents to quarantine for 14 days when they leave the Navajo Nation to travel to hotspots and return to the nation.
Thank you, Jordan Bennett-Begay. We'll be right back.
This is Indian Country Today.
What do we want? Justice! What do we want? Now! What do we want? Justice! What do we want? Now! If we don't get it, shut it down! If we don't get it, shut it down! Shut it down! If we don't get it, shut it down! This is KKK, no racist USA! No Trump! No KKK, no racist USA! What are you doing?
And we know that the movement for Black Lives and Black Lives Matter stands with us as Indigenous people as we collectively fight for our liberation, for the collective movement for our people. And our goal is not just to resist. Our goal is to radically transform this country so that it works for everybody. We're fighting for freedom, we're fighting for liberation, equity, and justice.
Nick Tilsen, Oglala Lakota, is president and CEO of the NDN Collective. He was arrested on July 3rd during a protest of President Donald Trump's rally at Mount Rushmore. There's a lot to talk about here, but let me start by saying what Nick Tilsen said after he was released from jail. I want to say this, that the justice system is a construct of white supremacy itself. The very system that we are trying to tear down are those systems of white supremacy that continue to perpetuate racism and injustice. Let me start there. Take our viewers to South Dakota, Nick Tilsen, and the very system with which you live every day.
Yeah, I mean, if you're gonna take us to South Dakota, you take to, the place in this country where you got 7 of the 11 poorest counties in America are all in South Dakota, and all Indian reservations in here. You got incarceration rates of Indigenous people in South Dakota that are 10 times the incarceration rates of white folks in South Dakota. In fact, there's more people being incarcerated, Indigenous people being incarcerated per capita compared to white people in South Dakota than any other place in America. And then you have that overlayered on top of that with this historic struggle over land and sovereignty. You have this reality that we have fought for the treaties of 1851 and 1868 to be upheld over time, and have taken those treaties all the way to the Supreme Court, and the Supreme Court ruled in our favor, yet we don't see land being returned to Indigenous people. And then you layer that back on top of, the fact that they take a sacred place like Mount Rushmore, like the sacred, the Chesapa there, that's the center of so much of our culture and our ceremonies, and to have a member of the Ku Klux Klan carve Mount Rushmore, in these faces of these colonizers who were who committed genocide and acts of aggression and violence towards Indigenous people, and this is our reality, and so it's our people historically, but it's directly connecting to the historic plight of what has happened to our people and connecting it to the real life issues that are alive and well today. You have a governor in South Dakota who is, hell-bent on restricting people's rights to protest, rights to organize, and is also, attacking both the Trump administration and the governor's office in South Dakota, making a big assault on tribal sovereignty by trying to impact the tribe's ability to to control their own borders in the protection of their communities and their people. And these are the things that we deal with on a daily here. And this is why so much of the, so much of what's happening in this country, in a conversation about dismantling white supremacy and working towards racial equity and racial justice in this country, is fundamentally important, because it is directly tied to the issues and the struggles that we face today that are directly impacting the lives of so many of our people.
You know, Nick Tilsen, one of the things that is striking is that we saw so much of the militarized activities by the federal government at Standing Rock, and we said that that was a precursor. And now we're seeing across the country the federal government using secret police basically to enforce the same sort of actions across the country. I mean, really, this is kind of the canary in a, I know that's an overused phrase, but the canary in a coal mine is what's happening in Indian country.
Yeah, I mean, and to me, the concerning thing about it is they're not just doing that based on, the fact that Indigenous people are organizing and protesting. They're doing it across several movements now. If you look at the rise of anti-protest bills and critical infrastructure bills to protect critical infrastructure like roads, like pipeline easements, like ways for people to be able to, express protest and civil disobedience, they directly targeted the Indigenous people's movement and the movement for Black Lives because of the organizing that was taking place there, and because the power of the people was being organized. And so I think that there is like critical infrastructure bills, and I think about 26 states now. And you can find out more about this information both through the Protect Dissent and Protect the Protest networks that are, groups that are actively building coalition around trying to fight the government's right to do this. And we're heading more and more to a militarized zone. And that the fact that we protested on our own land a few weeks ago in the sacred Geisapa, and the fact that the National Guard, the Highway Patrol, the Kapi'olani County Sheriff, and multiple law enforcement were deployed there, within minutes, is an attest to this, direction that the government is going in its relationship to Indigenous people and for Black lives, and to the people's power movements that are being built in this country.
I want to ask you about the long view, Nick Tilsen. One of the things that I think is extraordinary is that Taos Pueblo lost Blue Lake in 1906. And during that whole time, they said, it's going to come back, it's going to come back, it's ours. And it's the same in the Black Hills, even though the government, as you mentioned, a Supreme Court decision, eventually what's impossible happens.
Absolutely. I think 100%. I think that the time of us, especially at least the public lands in the Black Hills, we're returning to, Lakota and Indigenous control. It's no longer a question of if, it's a question of when. And in part of us, here at the NDN Collective and in this, this land back movement that we're continuing to build, it's the work that we're doing around building a land back movement here in the 21st century is this concept and idea that it's actually not just simply about physical, it's about physical returning of land back to Indigenous people, but it's decolonial work about actually deconstructing the system of supremacy and systematic racism that keep perpetual violence justice happening in our community. And so land back and land being returned to Indigenous people as a facet of the decolonial work that is taking place in this nation at this time, because clearly we're working towards getting our land back, but we also want to build a world that is just and equitable for all people and earth. And so in this work, that's so much of what this land back movement is about. I keep saying, hey, to be clear, we're coming for all of Indigenous people's land. We're coming for all of the Black Hills, but we'll take we'll take Mount Rushmore as a success in the meantime. Maybe not as a succession, but we'll take it in the meantime, because if you can actually take back this symbol that government calls the shrine of democracy, then it can actually be a catalytic impact on impacting multiple different other issues, including the issues of returning the rest of the public lands and the Black Hills to Lakota Indigenous control, along with many of the other land struggles that exist throughout Indian communities and Indian country. And so our hope is that this is a catalytic opportunity, and it directly connects that as we are in active dismantling supremacy, that Indigenous people's role in that movement is fundamentally connected directly to land and directly to addressing the systematic issues that we're faced with in our community today.
Nick Tilsen, thank you very much for joining us.
Thanks so much for having me, Mark, here on Indian Country Today.
We'll be right back.
This is Indian Country Today.
Mary Kathryn Nagle is an attorney, a playwright, and an advocate for justice for women, especially when it comes to public safety and ending the structure that supports violence against women. Last week, 5 tribes in Oklahoma reached a deal with the state on jurisdiction following the Supreme Court's McGirt decision. Mary Kathryn Nagle, let's start with the background of that decision, and then I understand you have some concerns going forward.
Yes, thank you, Mark. So in McGirt, the Muskogee Creek Nation and really all tribal nations won a historic victory in that the Supreme Court, despite Oklahoma's arguments that the court should judicially disestablish the Creek Nation's reservation, the Supreme Court applied the law as written, as it has for the last hundreds of years, and said there was a reservation created by a treaty. Congress has never disestablished it. The reservation still exists. And this has been an incredible victory, of course, for Creek Nation and Creek Nation citizens, but I think also for all of us who feel like finally we're witnessing a United States Supreme Court that is applying the law as it applies to tribal nations. And yes, as you mentioned last week, there was an agreement announced. I think for a lot of us who are citizens of one of the 5 tribes, which is the Seminole Nation, the Muskogee Creek Nation, Cherokee Nation, Chickasaw Nation, and Choctaw Nation in Oklahoma, this agreement in principle, as the Attorney General Mike Hunter calls it, was quite a surprise. We had not heard of this, nor had we read it before it was released Thursday morning. And so I think a lot of us from the 5 tribes in Oklahoma are still responding and reeling in the aftermath of this being released.
Well, and because it basically separates jurisdiction for Indian versus non-Indian, it creates particular issues for domestic violence and violence against women in general, does it not?
Yes, and to be clear, right now, this is just a 2-page PDF that the Attorney General Mike Hunter released, right? And he states in this document that he, with the 5 tribes, now, of course, Seminole Nation and Muskogee Creek Nation have said, no, we don't agree to that at all. But he said, the 5 tribes and I are going to move forward and ask Congress to pass this into a law. Right now, it's not a law. It's a 2-page PDF that the Attorney General has put out. But as an advocate for the rights of Native women and for safety for Native women, I and a lot of my colleagues have some very serious concerns about what would happen if A.G. Hunter's efforts here were successful. And just to talk about a couple of the implications, we won this huge victory in the Supreme Court, right? The last thing we want to see any of our tribal leaders do is acquiesce or to some sort of voluntary surrender of our sovereignty. And some of the specific points in that 2-page PDF are concerning. For instance, in that document, A.G. Hunter states that he and the 5 tribes will tell Congress, codify the Montana civil statutes. Now, what does that mean? The Supreme Court in 1981, in a case called Montana versus United States, limited tribal civil jurisdiction to cases where, in practical effect, for a tribe to exercise civil jurisdiction over a non-Indian, the tribe has to show that that non-Indian consented to the tribal jurisdiction through a contract or some other consensual relationship. This has proven to be somewhat disastrous for tribal courts, for instance, trying to issue tribal protective orders, even though in 2013, Congress passed the Violence Against Women Act and made very clear in that act that tribal courts have the authority, civil jurisdiction, to issue protective orders over non-Indian abusers, regardless of the lack of any contract signed with the tribe. Non-Indian abusers, I can tell you this as an advocate who tries to enforce tribal court protective orders in state courts all the time. State court judges get very confused, and when we have non-Indian abusers say, well, the Supreme Court said that I have to have a contract with the tribe or a consensual relationship before they can exercise jurisdiction over me, I don't consent to this, this tribal court protective order is invalid. That's what we're up against as advocates for Native women every day. Now, right now, that's a Supreme Court case that we're hoping the Supreme Court on its own will come to terms with and overturn. The last thing we want to do is ask Congress to codify it into a statute, and specifically into a statute that tribes apparently are promoting. And so I think the advocates for Native women on the ground in the field do have serious concerns about the proposal that AG Hunter has put forward.
Well, in fact, Mary Kathryn Nagle, if the tribes are against it, it's probably not going to go through Congress, at least in its current form.
Absolutely. And let's be clear, you know, there are tribes that are against it. Muskogee Creek Nation is against it. The Seminole Nation is against it. I've received many phone calls, emails, and text messages from tribal leaders across the country who are very concerned. And I do know that there are several tribal leaders who are saying, wait a second, this sort of voluntary surrender of sovereignty and the codification of Montana, you may say right now it only applies to the 5 tribes, but you're going to give that to Congress and let them do what they will with it. This could implicate all of Indian country. And I know there are a lot of Indian law practitioners and tribal sovereignty advocates across the country who are very concerned about this. And I can also tell you, having been on the phone with certain members of Congress this weekend, we have a lot of allies. And we have a lot of allies, especially that understand the connection between sovereignty and safety for Native women. And they're not going to let any bill get passed that undermines tribal sovereignty and hurts Native women. And they're especially not going to let Senator Inhofe disestablish the Creek Nation Reservation, which he is apparently threatening to do with the help of oil and gas. So there's a lot of fear right now. And I think certainly those of us in Oklahoma do have PTSD because, you know, there have been many attempts to erase us and disestablish us, right? We're still here. But I think we have a lot of fear and PTSD from that. And I'm hoping that right now, as citizens of the 5 tribes, as tribal leaders, as tribal governments, as tribal nations across the United States, we will stand for sovereignty, we'll stand together, and we'll tell anyone that wants to join Senator Inhofe in his attempt to disestablish us, it's not possible, not in 2020, not happening.
So if you take the tribe's victory in McGirt and the structure of the Violence Against Women Act, what's the best way forward? How can you move the ball to actually improve the daily life of women who face really difficult situations?
This is a great question. And what we need is not legislation from Congress, but we need collaboration, intergovernmental agreements. The jurisdiction is there. The authority of the tribal government's there, not fully. Some of it's been taken away by the Supreme Court, but the state does have authority in some instances, and so does the U.S. Attorney's Office, right? What we need are these 3 governments to come down, sit down, and talk. How do we collaborate? How do we, you know, enter into cross-deputization agreements? How do we collaborate on investigations? It's not always obvious immediately who has jurisdiction, right? It can depend on the identity of the victim, the identity of the perpetrator, whether the crime was ultimately committed on reservation, off reservation. And these are issues, let's be clear, that affect Native communities in Montana on the border towns of reservations, in Alaska, in Oklahoma, in South Dakota. This is not unique to Oklahoma. We've watched tribal leaders at tribes like Puyallup and Gila River, you know, enter into these sorts of intergovernmental agreements with the federal government and the state government and local county municipalities to ensure that any time a crime is committed, any question about jurisdiction does not impede an arrest, a detainment of a suspect, an investigation. And that's what we need here. And I know that Creek Nation is actively engaged. They already have lots of intergovernmental agreements on the books. And I'm hoping the other 5 tribes, many of them have engaged in those in the past, and that they will continue to do so, because I think that's the real key to ensuring public safety on the 5 tribes reservations in Oklahoma.
Why do you think Oklahoma was so quick to come up with a solution that basically cut out the win of the Supreme Court?
Well, I'm going to be honest. AG Hunter has not explained his thinking to me personally, so I can't speak for him. But the best guess I have is we're certainly hearing everyone is talking about the pressure from oil and gas. And I think, we just listened to Nick Tilsen, who I have so much respect for, right? Our brothers and sisters in South and North Dakota know what sovereignty means to oil and gas, right? There's a reason Dakota Access decided to desecrate human remains and sacred sites on the border of Standing Rock's reservation. They didn't want to go through a reservation, right? Tribal governments do have some authority over whether or not you can desecrate their sacred sites on the reservation. So they went around the reservation and desecrated those sites. So I think oil and gas is very fearful of what might happen if tribal nations can protect their native women, their sacred sites in Oklahoma, and they're seeking to use the congressional delegation in Oklahoma to undermine tribal sovereignty, and we have to stand against that.
Mary Kathryn Nagle, thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you so much for having me, Mark. Always a pleasure.
That's another edition of Indian Country Today. Thank you for joining us. I'm Mark Trahant.
This is Indian Country Today.